Pelosi and her wonderful staff for hosting us today, and the incredible staff at the Capitol Visitor Center, Anne Marie, with AV. If you've ever done an event, the one thing you don't want to go wrong is AV, so thank you, Anne Marie. Today's conversation is being live streamed, and it will be on the committee's website and our YouTube channel. If you do utilize social media, please consider using our hashtag, which is FDRMemorial@25. Again, that is FDRMemorial@25. A few other housekeeping items. You are all welcome to join us on the beautiful rooftop of 101 Constitution after this at 6:30 p.m. for a reception. Hope to see you there. And then also for tomorrow's dedication at 11 a.m., which will be near the wheelchair statue at the memorial. We ask that if you are going to attend tomorrow that you arrive no later than 10:30 a.m. as we will begin promptly at 11 a.m. Please silence your phones if you haven't done so already. That's the last housekeeping item, I promise. And now I'm really excited to introduce our moderator. Every esteemed panel begins with an esteemed moderator, and we certainly have that in Jonathan Capehart today. Jonathan is a Pulitzer Prize-winning associate editor of the Washington Post. Since 2007, he has been an opinion writer and a member of the Post editorial board. He hosts weekly opinions podcast Capehart, formerly known as Cape Up, and on the weekly Washington Post live show, First Look, which is also streamed on The Choice, MSNBC, on Comcast Peacock streaming service. At MSNBC, Jonathan is the anchor of The Sunday Show with Jonathan Capehart. His MSNBC special, A Promised Land, A Conversation with Barack Obama, was nominated in 2021 for an Emmy for Outstanding News, Discussion, and Analysis. His MSNBC special, Pride of the White House, won a GLAAD Media Award for Outstanding TV Journalism Long Form just this year. At PBS, Jonathan serves as a political analyst on the PBS NewsHour and is featured on the very popular Friday segment, Brooks and Capehart. Jonathan has generously donated his time and energy to these incredibly important anniversary events, and we are so grateful to him. Please welcome today's moderator, Mr. Jonathan Capehart.
Thank you very much, Jason, for your introduction. It's always a little odd when you hear someone else read your bio. A little embarrassing, but thank you, Jason. If this room looks familiar, if you have not put it together why this room looks familiar, it is the room President Zelensky of Ukraine addressed Congress on March 16th of this year, making his case for assistance, rightly arguing that Ukraine's fight against Russia's invasion of his country is part of a larger fight of democracy against autocracy. So just to set the tone and let you know where you are in a relatively new room, but already an historic room. So thank you all for being here. We have a very good panel discussion that is going to happen with Senator Harkin, Valerie Jarrett, the CEO of the Obama Foundation, Mary Dolan, Executive Director of the FDR Memorial Legacy Committee, and Dr. David Bollner, Senior Fellow and Resident Historian at the Roosevelt Institute. But before you hear from them, I have the honor of introducing to you Her Excellency, Ambassador Anniken Krupnes, Norwegian Ambassador to the United States. Please welcome Ambassador.
Let me first thank the FDR Memorial Legacy Committee and its anniversary co-chairs, Senator Harkin and James Roosevelt Jr. for the kind invitation to speak to you today. It's a true privilege to be here. The FDR Memorial represents a pivotal time in history for the United States and of course for Norway as well. And it also reflects the importance of equality and full participation for people with disabilities. To this day, Franklin D. Roosevelt remains an inspiration to people all over the world. A reminder to stand firm in the face of tyranny, refuse to give up in hard times, and be proud of our differences. As you might know, or not know, Norway has a very special connection to America's 32nd president. In 1940, when the Nazis invaded Norway, the King Haakon VII, and his son, Prince Olav, went into exile in London. But Olav's wife, Crown Princess Märtha, and their 3 children did not go to London. They, in the interest of safety, accepted President Roosevelt's invitation to come to the United States. After arriving in the US, Martha and her 3 children, Ragnhild, Astrid, and Harald is our king today, they were welcomed in the White House, where they stayed for a few weeks. And the little family actually lived in the DC area until 1945, when the war was over and they could go back to Norway. During this period, Crown Princess Märtha and President Roosevelt developed a strong friendship. Some of you might have seen the television series Atlantic Crossing, and that is a fictionalized version of it. But it is true that they had a very strong friendship and that they met often. And I just did a fact check, and during those 4.5 years that she stayed here, they met 248 times in person. I calculated, that's like once a week. And they shared a robust sense of humor. They visited one another's homes. She was in Camp David. She spent Christmas in the White House. And they discussed the progress of the war. And I know that Märtha received news from London every time she was going to see the president. So she worked as a diplomat. There's a statue outside my home in Massachusetts Avenue. If you go on Mass Avenue, you will start with Nelson Mandela, his hand like that, then you have Winston Churchill, he goes like that, and then you have Märtha who's waving. And she's the only lady at Mass Avenue, and no, I moved in, so that's a good thing. In 1942, the United States provided Norway with a warship called King Haakon VII, and it was ceremonially bestowed on Princess Märtha at its official launch at the Washington Navy Yard. And there the president made what is now known as his Look to Norway speech. He said, "If there is anyone who is still wondering why this war is being fought, let him look to Norway. If anyone has any delusions that this war could have been averted, let him look to Norway. And if anyone still doubts the democratic will to win, again I say, let him look to Norway." Today, in a similar way, we look to Ukraine. As they fight to defend democracy and they face a brutal aggressor. The situation there has been on everyone's mind in the 11 weeks since the country was invaded. Many nations, including Norway and the United States, have helped the war effort by sending supplies and military assistance. And I'm pleased that Congress passed the Ukraine Democracy Defense Lend-Lease Act of 2022. This will make the process of getting military supplies to Ukraine and other countries that have been affected by the invasion faster and more efficient. And the initiative resurrects President Roosevelt's own Lend-Lease Act, which allowed the United States to lend and lease military equipment to its allies during World War II. Norway was one of the countries that benefited from this. Another example of a strong transatlantic relationship. And Norway will always be thankful for American assistance during the war, and we're proud to call the United States an ally and a friend. On another topic, the FDR Memorial is emblematic of the need to include people with disabilities in all areas of public life. When you look at the statue of President Roosevelt, his wheelchair is not hidden away. It's in full view, in a place accessible to visitors who may use wheelchairs or other mobility aids. This is thanks to the FDR Memorial Legacy Committee, who worked to make the memorial accessible to all. In Norway, we place much importance on this kind of inclusion. And I would just like to mention that in February this year, Oslo virtually hosted the UN Development Committee's second Global Disability Summit. Norway is also a signatory of the 2006 UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which we ratified in 2013. Both direct and indirect discrimination against disabled people is against the law. And among other things, this means that public transportation is accessible to those using mobility aids. Shops and restaurants, feature ramps, service animals like guard dogs are welcome into public spaces. Disability benefits are available to those who need them. It says in my manuscript. I'm sure it's not that easy. I am absolutely certain that there are still lots of lacks out there, and you would know that. And I think that there is still so much to do. And in doing that, we can take inspiration from President Roosevelt and his accomplishments. And we know that there is no limit to what people with disabilities can achieve. My own father was in a wheelchair for 17 years, and he's the strongest and best human man I've ever known. Roosevelt was such a staunch defender of freedom at home and abroad, and a friend to those in need. He rightly remains one of the most admired US presidents at all times, both here and around the world. And I know that we will all continue to keep his legacy in mind as we move forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Madam Ambassador, Ambassador Krupnes. I'm going to call the members of the panel up one by one in order of how you're sitting, starting with the chair closest to the one that I was sitting in. Dr. David Molnar, as I said a moment ago, is a senior fellow and resident historian at the Roosevelt Institute. Valerie Jarrett is the CEO of the Obama Foundation. Seems like a lot of you know the next person I'm about to introduce, the former U.S. Senator Tom Harkin. Last but not least, Mary E. Dolan, Executive Director, FDR Memorial. Thank you all very much for spending this part of the afternoon with all of us. Senator Harkin, precedence of protocol demand that I start with you. But it's a pleasure to start with you. I'm fine. How are you? Do you have your microphone? Okay, good. Just checking. So as I mentioned before, we are in an historic group, and as the ambassador just talked about, the legacy of President Roosevelt was also one that was steeped in defending democracy versus autocracy. And so, you know, the lessons of history and the past, of course, of the Roosevelt era, have much to offer to today's leaders as we work on critical issues facing the country today: social and economic justice, climate change, preserving democracy. Senator, what should Americans draw from in the Roosevelt era to help with today?
Is this on?
That's
parts of the New Deal. And he said that these autocratic forces, if I remember right, that they put on the clothes of constitutional ideals in order to mask what they really want. And that is basically to impose their will on everybody else. So this was a time it was a perilous time in the United States. Sort of like what we're facing right now. Roosevelt correctly identified this and spoke about it in his second inaugural address. And basically said that we have to persevere. We have to use the word patience. We have to be patient. But we have to continue to understand that the best way forward is through I think he used the word participation in democracy, or something like participating in democracy, representative democracy. So what we're confronting right now is a situation in America where people are being led by misinformation, disinformation, social media, to think that perhaps what really happened in the election didn't really happen. That small forces need to overcome the will of the people in order to sort of save our country. These autocratic forces. So I think what we learned from Roosevelt's time is that we faced this before in our country. Now the difference being they didn't have social media at that time, and the pervasiveness of social media. But I still think the same sort of charges that Roosevelt gave the American people at that time, and the kind of leadership that he showed, is still applicable today.
Dr. Walden, I'm going to bring you in on this question, since you are the scholar here on the panel. I mean, President Biden has remarked that the world we live in today seems locked in a struggle between democracy and autocracy. How might just to pick up on what Senator Harkin is talking about, how might the experiences of the Roosevelts help guide today's efforts to strengthen democracy, both at home and abroad?
Well, in his Economic Bill of Rights speech in January 1944, Franklin Roosevelt said, "We've come to the clear realization of the fact that necessitous men are not free men. People who are hungry and out of a job are the stuff with which dictatorships are made." Of course, he was saying that in 1944. He's reflecting not only on the war itself, but he's reflecting on the Great Depression and the terrible economic hardship the country was living in. You know, when Roosevelt became president on the 3rd or 4th of March 1933, over 25% of the people in the country were unemployed, but in places like Chicago and Detroit, unemployment was above 50%. The mayor of Chicago once said, "You don't send relief, send in troops. Now we'll have a revolution on our hands." So I think when you're thinking about democracy and you're thinking about Roosevelt, you have to think about it both at home and abroad, in the sense that in many ways, through the 100 days, through all of the legislation of the New Deal, Franklin Roosevelt really saved a liberal capitalist democracy. You know, contrast the rise of fascism in Europe and in Asia. You need to remember that the Great Depression was a global crisis, not confined to the United States. So both during the 30s and in the 40s, he was dedicated to the idea of
the experience or the legacy of FDR play into the thinking and discussions and the policies that President Obama and the Obama administration came up with to deal with that terrible financial crisis?
First of all, call me Valerie, not Miss Jarrett. Hello, everybody. It's just a pleasure to be here, particularly in this room at this historic moment. So I think President Obama is a student of history, and he appreciated the importance of the kind of leadership our country needs during tumultuous times. And great presidents in our nation's history have not governed during easy times. Great presidents have always governed during really challenging times. And Senator Harkin, when I was listening to you, I was reminded of stories that my mother told me throughout my childhood of listening to President Roosevelt's fireside chats. Now, it was a lot easier back then because he had, as my mother described, the country captivated. And my mother would say how she and her sister and her parents would sit around the radio as though they were looking at a television, and they weren't. They were listening to a radio and hang on his every word. And what she said to me that she always remembered was, this is going to take years for us to recover. But if we do this together, we will get through this. And he said 5 years to begin with. And we talked about that conversation when President Obama was going through the financial crisis of 2009. And he said, do the American people have the same patience for sacrifice and stick-to-itiveness and recognizing that we didn't get into this ditch overnight? We're not going to, as to mix my metaphors, turn the battleship around overnight. But I think he got a lot of strength from the fact that through leadership, such as the leadership of President Roosevelt, through tough times, where you communicate continuously with the American people, we are still capable of doing great things. And so I think his legacy had a lot to do to motivate President Obama about what was possible with this great country. And in fact, it turned out that the American people did have the resilience to get through it, and the unemployment rate was cut in half during the 8 years of his presidency. And the banks were saved, and the automobile industry was saved. And that was not through the act of one person, but it was through the act of one person motivating so many others to take the long view. Something, again, I think that both presidents were very good at doing. And in order to take the long view, you have to be able to absorb a lot of frustration and anger and disappointment. I mean, millions of people were losing their homes, their jobs, angry that the banks were not paying a price for it, that they could see comparable to the price that they were paying. And President Obama said, look, we have to have the banks in order to have the liquidity that our businesses, small and large, need. But we also have to then put in place some accountability. And so not just getting through the crisis, but trying to put some rules of the road in place so that that crisis didn't repeat itself.
Mary, this is a perfect spot to bring you in because we're talking about the legacy of FDR. And you, as the steward of that legacy, as the executive director of the FDR Memorial Legacy Committee. The committee was only established in 2019, but your relationship goes a whole lot further back than that. It goes back to 1995. Tell us about that.
It does sound like a long time ago, doesn't it? Some of you actually weren't even born. So 1995, I was 20-something and out of graduate school, and I luckily got a job. You know, right after school, sometimes that doesn't. You need to be patient, and especially in Washington, there's a lot of you out there. You know what I mean. You're hungry and you want to make a difference. Finally, got hired by an organization called the National Organization on Disability. And within a few months, we were told that we were leading the campaign to add a depiction of FDR as a disabled person to the FDR Memorial. And I said, okay, boss, whatever you say. And I kind of came up through that campaign and really grew to understand the power and the pride of the disability community. But when the memorial was opened in 1997, as Gloria says it was missing a depiction of FDR in a wheelchair. And the years leading up to that 1997 dedication, There was an epic campaign led by disabled leaders, one who's in the audience today, Jim Dixon, Mike DeLand, Jane DeLand, his widow is in the audience as well, and Alan Reich, and so many other people, including Senator Harkin here and Dr. Woolner, who were all supporters, and Mr. Roosevelt, Mr. Kovler, of course, so many. And I'm sorry if I'm forgetting anybody, but the evening, a few nights before the dedication, that May 2nd, 1997 dedication, when the disability community still was not pleased with the responses in terms of how that depiction would look, President Clinton said, legislation is going to be offered. And it was, and it passed, and several years later, with the money in hand, a gorgeous statue by Robert Graham. Stephen Graham, his son, is here with us. A statue by Robert Graham of FDR in a wheelchair was installed at the memorial. So when you mentioned 5 years, Valerie, so this was a 6-year campaign led by a disability organization. And if anybody out there also works for disability organizations, you know that suddenly pivoting to a whole new project that isn't already bankrolled or that you have sponsors for isn't usually what happens. So this was on the sheer guts of the leadership of the disability community, and that's where I started. And 20 years later, here we are. 25, actually.
So can I do me a favor? You mentioned a lot of people who were there at the beginning and who fought to have that statue be a part of the memorial. Could the people who buried Dolan just singled out, could you please stand up or wave your hands?
And Dr. Atkins, Roy, please.
Thank you. As I get older, I'm now more and more insistent that the hard work of everyday people that doesn't normally get acknowledged, that it gets acknowledged, because that is hard work, especially to do what you were able to accomplish. Senator Hart, I see you champing a bit here.
A little side story.
Of course.
Sometimes the side stories are even more interesting than what we see.
Now the pressure's on.
Well, okay, so there was the commission, remember Clark Pepper was called in to head it towards the late 80s. Then he died, and then shortly after the passage and signing of the Americans with Disabilities Act, the commission asked Senator Inouye from Hawaii, and a Democrat, and Senator Mark Hatfield from Oregon, a Republican, to chair the commission. And they did. Well, as commissions go, and they already had the basic design that had been accepted over the old one, and then this organization, National Organization on Disability, and Alan Wright and Jim and Mike DeLand started agitating to get this additional statute. Well, this rubbed the commission the wrong way. And initially, and I remember it well because both were great friends of mine, and I served on the Appropriations Committee with them, they were opposed to it. They had dug in their heels. They weren't going to change. This was the plan. This was the design. That's the end of it. Well, the National Organization on Disability garnered support from other disability groups, and quite frankly, they wore them down. And people came to their offices in their home states, and little bit by little bit, finally, both Hatfield and Inouye changed their position. In fact, it was Senator Inouye who introduced the resolution And he got it passed in one day on the Senate floor. And that's just a little side story.
My gosh. Wow. And I was actually going to ask you to tell this story, so I'm glad you jumped in and told the story. Dr. Woolner, still speaking about the memorial, was designed to tell the story and showcase the legacy of the FDR era. How much did the president and Eleanor Roosevelt think about or speak about their legacies? Do you think the memorial captures what they wanted?
Well, I think the memorial, it's a wonderful, wonderful memorial, and I think in many respects the four rooms, the Depression, the transition into the war, and so forth, does a wonderful job of capturing the essence of that generation, that spirit of that generation that lived through the Great Depression and World War II. And especially now that the wheelchair is in there. And I remember that debate, very intense. It was a very intense debate, a very public debate about whether or not the president should be depicted in a wheelchair. And it was a wonderful day when that happened. And I was there for the unveiling of that particular moment as well. But, it's interesting. So in a sense, I think the addition of the wheelchair really completes the story. It's very moving, of course. There's so many things you could think about when you think about Franklin Roosevelt and his disability. Of course, if he had come into the room to speak here today, the Secret Service would have come in first. They would have bolted the podium to the floor. He would have been wheeled in. He would pull himself up, lock his braces into place, grab the podium with his left hand, and then the audience would come in often after he had situated himself. So it's a very moving story. I think that this president who couldn't get out of bed in the morning without the assistance of others led the nation through the Great Depression and the Second World War. But if you were to ask them, and I don't know if Jim will agree with me on this, but if you were to ask Franklin and Eleanor, I think what they would say would be the greatest legacy, certainly in the case of Franklin Roosevelt, he would say the United Nations. Shortly before his death, he had an extraordinary interview with the New York Times, and Ann O'Hare McCormick was an extraordinary interview. He basically talked about all four of his terms in office. And she wrote that, his one great ambition in life was to go down in history where President Wilson had failed and to create the United Nations. And of course, he was very anxious to do it before the war ended because he knew that in the case of the League of Nations, which was designed after the war, that was a great failure. But if you keep the alliance together long enough to create the United Nations, that would have been his great legacy. And then, of course, for Eleanor Roosevelt, it's the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, passed by the United Nations in 1948. So, from their perspective, I think that would have been what they would consider their greatest legacy. Let me just add one quick story, Senator Harkin. In 1941, after going to a funeral, Franklin Roosevelt was talking to Felix Frankfurter, his friend. And just out of the blue, he said, Felix, I'm probably going to kick the bucket long before you do. And he said, I have a request for you that I don't want you to forget. And he said, that little green triangle in front of the National Archives? That's where I want my memorial. If anybody's going to put a memorial up to me, that's what I want. They want it to be bigger than my desk. They can make it out of stone, they can make it out of marble, they can make whatever they want. But that's all I want. And he just wanted his dates and name. And it's there today. It's a very charming, small little memorial. It's fascinating that it's in front of the National Archives because he was such a great lover of history.
I always wondered about that, if that was really meant to be a memorial to him, for him. But I didn't realize that that was his express wish. Valerie, your full-time job among many is also helping to preserve another president's legacy, President Obama's legacy, his 8 years in the White House. The way we memorialize
that's what I think you find is the case with the FDR Memorial. The people who have done the research, who understand the history and his contribution to it, keep it alive by telling those stories. And for President Obama, who obviously is still alive at the time that his foundation was launched and that this center is now under construction on the south side of Chicago, he often says, look, what I want this to be is not a legacy to the past of what I accomplished. It is what do we do to use that sense of past to help the leaders of tomorrow. And so he is very forward-facing and thinks that his legacy will be, if there are thousands of Barack and Michelle Obamas around the world, that he has helped train with the leadership skills that we're embedding in our programs. And I think it's also really important to him that the foundation and that the center doesn't just begin with Barack and Michelle Obama. It begins with, on the first floor, with those upon whose shoulders we stand. And talks about that sense of history and how to build upon it. So it's not one finite beginning with their birth, but really all of those in history who made his presidency possible. And then going forward to tell the story of his presidency, yes, to educate people, but also importantly, to inspire and empower them to go to lead the center and realize the possibilities that they have to be leaders in their own small community or on the world stage. And so if he does that correctly through this center, the legacy is far from finished. The legacy is actually just beginning.
So to pick up on what's going to be at the Obama Presidential Center, there's going to be something related to Eleanor Roosevelt.
Yes, that's why I'm here. Yes, there is. So just to give you a little bit of, to center you on it, the center will be located on the south side of Chicago. It's 19.3 acres, so it's a big site. It's currently, as I said, under construction. It will have the library. It will have a forum building for gatherings for the community and gatherings for the world. It will have a Chicago Public Library. It's very important to both Obamas that we focus on literacy for our young children, the children in the surrounding community feel that this campus belongs to them. It will have an athletic center. It will have water treatments and parks and walking trails and sledding trails in the winter in Chicago, where we'll have to build some hills because there are no hills in Chicago. And it's immediately adjacent to the Museum of Science and Industry and the University of Chicago with a magnificent view of Lake Michigan. And continuing Mrs. Obama's legacy from her time in the White House, it will have a fruit and vegetable garden. Why? Well, the idea of a fruit and vegetable garden originated with Eleanor Roosevelt, who was the first lady to have a fruit and vegetable garden on the grounds of the White House. And they were victory gardens at a time when her husband was calling on the nation to build gardens and produce food all their own, because obviously there was a scarcity of food in our country. She thought, well, let's lead by example and create one right here at the White House. And so when Mrs. Obama created her fruit and vegetable garden, it was inspired by Eleanor Roosevelt. So the vegetable garden and fruit and vegetable garden and the Obama Presidential Center will be named the Eleanor Roosevelt Fruit and Vegetable Garden. And yeah, I think it's very cool. And if you stay tuned tomorrow, you'll hear more about it at that time. And I would mention that, correct me for those of you who know, but I do believe that the memorial for FDR here is the only one of the presidential memorials that has a statue of a First Lady. And I think when Michelle Obama thinks of Eleanor Roosevelt, she thinks of a humanitarian, a trailblazer, a fighter for social justice and for civil rights, a person who believed in inclusion, a person who was committed to refugees around the world, and who appreciated how important it is to be able to grow fruits and vegetables. And so not only is the garden that Eleanor Roosevelt had at the White House an inspiration for both Obamas, but also her legacy, a woman who used her platform and her voice to be a force for good, and also to amplify the messages of the president. And that's very similar to the approach that Michelle Obama took as First Lady of the United States.
Valerie and Mary, I want to pull you in on this particular question, because I'm glad you brought this up, Valerie, about Eleanor Roosevelt, a woman using her voice and her platform equality. So I'm wondering for both of you, the meaning of Eleanor Roosevelt and the leadership she showed back then to the way you go about showing and exerting leadership today. Valerie, then.
Well, she was on a very personal note, an inspiration for me. I have been a decade-long fighter for women's equality, for equality for people of color, for people from the LGBT community, for people from the disabilities community, who I'm just delighted to see my friends here today, to create an even playing field. And I think that that's what her life was committed to at a time where initially it was not popular. She pushed the edges of the envelope. She did what was unconventional for women to do, but history remembers her as one of the most popular first ladies, not just in the United States, but on the world stage. And so I think she is a good example that sometimes, well, not sometimes, leaders push the envelope. That's what it means to lead. And you don't do it to win a popularity contest when you begin to fight to change the status quo, because there are a lot of people who are quite entrenched with the status quo. It's working very comfortably for them. And so you're going to meet with resistance, which is back to my earlier point of being able to absorb a certain amount of pain. But I think her true north should be our true north, and that we should use her as an example in this current climate, which is more complicated, for as Senator Harkin mentioned, an era of disinformation where it's really hard to communicate. But the power, again, back to the legacy that President and Mrs. Obama are trying to create, is the power of each of us to recognize the potential of our voices. And that each of us have this responsibility to push the envelope and to not sit by and watch injustices happen to somebody else just because they're not happening directly to you, but to accept our mutual responsibility to make our union more perfect. And let's face it, we have a ways to go right now.
And Mary, so were you channeling your inner Eleanor Roosevelt when you got into the fight for representation of the president's disability in that memorial?
I have to be honest, I have been growing in my learning about Eleanor Roosevelt. And I don't mean to sound disrespectful, but back in 1995, I was young and I was glad I was getting paid. And I said, oh, okay, sure, let's go have a fight. We're going to have a protest, sure, I'll make the photocopies. But through those years, and there's a few people here who I see smiling who are probably there with me, but through the years and also through my own experience with disability and becoming further embedded into the community, I personally took on the passion as well. So I think there's a lot of people that I pull from, but I'd say in my learnings about Eleanor Roosevelt, the thing that really strikes me is allyship. Her friendship with Mary McLeod Bethune, for instance, is Mary McLeod Bethune is there's a statue of her in Washington, D.C., and I can't wait for us to pair school visits to the FDR Memorial with a visit to the Mary McLeod Bethune statue in Washington, D.C. She had great allyship also with Helen Keller. We have some friends here from AFB, American Federation of the Blind, American Foundation of the Blind, pardon me. And because of that allyship, eventually the talking book came about. So there is much to be said about stepping outside of where you are, extending your hand, and my job now, I feel, is to show that allyship to new generations, that is how progress gets made. It's not by staying in your silo, and heck, I love being in my silo too, where it's comfy, but I'm not going to get anywhere with what I want to do just with folks like me. So allyship is where it's at, and that's the kind of work that we're trying to do, and making sure that some of the other narratives of the FDR Memorial, such as Eleanor, I mean, she is a statue there, and it's gorgeous and it's wonderful, but I want to make sure that there's even more time spent at her statue. I want to have more kids really understand what the promise of the United Nations is, how progressive she was. I want students to know about the work of Mrs. Bethune and how amazing what she did. I mean, she was the head of the alternate cabinet, and that's not in enough lesson plans. So me and my fellow educators, I got a couple in the front row there. So just a quick shout out to Professor Arlene Kingberry from the University of the District of Columbia, and Dr. Rosalie Boone, who is retired from Howard University, who without the both of them, our education program would be not as full-blown as it is. So I want to especially give tribute to them.
I might just add that the first book that Eleanor Roosevelt published in 1933 was entitled "It's Up to the Women."
I'm glad you brought that up because I was going to ask you, as the scholar here on the panel, to talk about, if you could, the evolution in the perceptions and understanding and the legacy of Eleanor Roosevelt, because it has changed over time.
Well, she's an extraordinary figure, as Mary and Valerie just pointed out. I mean, we need to remember that she really kind of came into her own in 1920, or even at the very end of the First World War, when she started working with the Red Cross. She'd already been working in the Settlement House movement in Manhattan. But remember, women had just gained the right to vote, and she got very involved in the Democratic Party politics in Dutchess County and in New York State and then nationally. So she's really a kind of pioneer in organizing women within that political context. And very quickly, I think Jim would agree, very quickly in the 1920s, political advisors like Louis Howe, who was Franklin Roosevelt's #1 political advisor for many, many years, began relying on her because it was the women who were getting out the vote. He was carrying upstate New York voters, which had never happened before. It was largely the Republican district, but they were out there organizing. And of course, through those years, as First Lady of New York, and then of course as First Lady of the President, she was just completely, I don't know how to describe it, so completely out of the box, so to speak. I mean, she first of all said, well, I want to have all women's press conferences, because women were not able to gain the kind of career in journalism that men had. So she had these all women's press conferences, and she's a very clever woman, and I think others will agree, because she said, well, I'm not going to talk about politics, because this is very controversial, but she would talk about issues, right? So she wouldn't necessarily talk about direct political questions, but she'd bring up issues like race or women's rights and these kinds of issues. So slowly but surely, she gained greater and greater and greater public persona. And then, of course, she started writing her column, My Day, in 1935, all the way up through the end of her life, 6 or 7 days a week. And the best example I think I can give, and this is one that I'm particularly moved by because I had the pleasure of meeting some of these pilots. She would write about her experiences, and as I said, very clever. She wouldn't necessarily take on an issue, right in its face. She would subtly get into it. So she went to the Tuskegee Institute, and remember, this is a time when having the First Lady photographed with African Americans was controversial. Well, just imagine the First Lady of the United States going to Tuskegee, and these pilots who wanted to fly combat missions said, hey, Mrs. Roosevelt, you want to go for a ride? And she said, sure. And they photographed her with these pilots. Then she went back to Washington, and she explained to her husband, the president, that these young men want to fly combat missions, and he created the Tuskegee Airmen. They were called the Red Tails, right? They had a red tail on them. The pilots who are flying the bomber missions, remember, these are fighter pilots now. These black pilots are fighter pilots. They are there to protect the bombers. And the bomber pilots are virtually, well, they're all white, of course. And pretty soon they're saying, we want the Red Tails. We want the Red Tails. They had the best record in the Second World War in terms of protecting the bomber crews. It's just an extraordinary story, and one that really goes back to Eleanor Roosevelt and her decision to take that ride in an airplane.
Senator Harkin, could you share your family story about FDR and
think what you're probably referring to is a story I've told before, maybe?
Probably.
No. You have to understand this. My father had a 6th grade education. My mother was an immigrant. We lived in a small town of about 100 people in rural Iowa. My father had been a coal miner most of his life. And he got married later, but anyway, during the Depression, the mines had closed. He was out of work. He had 6 kids. And he just didn't know what he was going to do. Well, he finally got a notice that he could go to work on the WPA. Now I forget how much. It was like $14 a week or something like that on WPA. So he got his WPA card and he worked on WPA. They built a high school that's still in use today. They built a recreation lake that's still in use as a park today. And they started building a small reservoir near Des Moines, Iowa, and it was finished. My father always took pride in that. And he always felt that Franklin Roosevelt not only gave him a job, but saved his family. I don't know what we would have done. We had no other source of income. We had no money. And so later on, I never ever had an I love me wall when I was in the Senate or House. But what
Oh, that's a great line. I love me one.
know, me with this person, me with that famous person, all that kind of stuff. What I did is I framed my dad's WPA card. And I put it right by my door. So that every time I walked out to go vote, I saw that WPA card. And it reminded me. It reminded me of why I'm there. And so that WPA card is now in my office at the Harkin Institute at Drake University in Des Moines. But I just close on this. My father loved Franklin Roosevelt. And I can remember as a young boy after World War II that my father would always talk about Roosevelt in just, I don't know what kind of terms I would say, reverential type terms. And he always said, it took a crippled man to lead a crippled country. Today we don't use those words, but I guess we would say it took a disabled man to lead a disabled country. And that's how my father thought of Franklin Roosevelt, and so you can see why I became a Roosevelt fan at an early age.
Dr. Woolner, a moment ago, in answer, when you were talking about Eleanor Roosevelt, you just sort of said Jim. And I want to acknowledge who Jim is, because Jim isn't just any Jim. Jim is Jim Roosevelt, President Roosevelt's grandson, so Jim Wade, so folks, So Mary, every year, I think 3 million people go through the FDR Memorial. Many of them are school groups. What are they drawn to? This is a multi-part question. First question, what are they drawn to?
A couple of things. The first thing that all the visitors see is wonderfully the FDR wheelchair statue. It's couldn't be better placed. And it does draw people in. If you've been to the FDR Memorial, and especially if you see school kids, they're hanging on him, they've got their arms around him, they're sitting on his lap, and it is a beautiful interactive experience, and it was designed that way by the brilliant artist, Robert Graham, to be life-size, away from the wall, not on a pedestal, so that you could be with your friend FDR. So there's a tremendous amount of interaction. Another favorite, of course, is Fala. Everyone loves Fala, and that's a wonderful addition and so playful. And it makes me always remember that these memorials are for future generations, and you get them young. And so, yeah, there might be some kids who go there and that's all that they'll remember, but they'll go back again and they'll keep building on that knowledge. So those are two elements in particular that I see how people are drawn to. And the last piece I'd say, though, is that some folks miss that the memorial was built in such a way as a radical departure from how other memorials are. So think of the Lincoln Memorial, think of Jefferson, even the obelisk of the Washington Monument. They are awe-striking, sort of one and done, fantastic. But the FDR Memorial by the famed architect Lawrence Halprin was meant to be a contemplative, park-like setting where it unfolds and it tells a story. And so you see a lot of people spending a lot of time there. So it isn't a, let me get there, get the gram, and then go. It is a walk through a park, and it's meditative. And I have met so many people who come up to me and they say, I went there for my wedding pictures. I went there for pictures before my prom. I bring my children there every Sunday. I go story after story after story of how people use it because it is such a unique piece of land, and how it speaks to people can be interpreted in multiple different ways.
I love that you made you contrasted it with the Lincoln Memorial and the Jefferson Memorial. What I'm about to say doesn't exactly fit with the Washington Monument, but the thing that came to mind is that the FDR Memorial, compared to Lincoln and Jefferson, is accessible. Folks can get there, no matter their ability. They can go through and see this museum. One more question. When it comes to the wheelchair, I'm wondering if you have any insights you can bring to how the reactions of people who have been going to the memorial, the reactions of people to the wheelchair from the first time it showed up to now. I can imagine that when it first showed up, a lot of people may have been either put off by it or wondering what's this about. And maybe today, with kids jumping on, and no big deal.
I definitely would like to have Senator Harkin chime in on this piece, but I know that people go through the memorial now and they don't know that wheelchair statue wasn't there. And they go, wait, what? It wasn't there? How could it not have been there? Wait, it was a fight. How could that have been a fight? Wasn't that an easy decision? Wait, it took 6 years? Huh? Wait, what? How much money? Wait, huh? So we have our work cut out, and I love talking about this story because it was probably one of the most exciting things in my young life at that time that I've gotten a chance to be part of. So I think there's a great importance in keeping that story alive. And so when it did open, luckily there was still some space amazingly left over that they could add on to a prologue room. But Senator, how about you? When you go through there, do you see the love of the statue?
One time, this was several years ago, I was down, since I retired, I was down at the monument with my grandkids, and we were walking through, and I stopped at the statue with a wheelchair, and I was going to talk to my grandkids about that. There was a family, a man, a woman, maybe a couple of kids, and the little boy said, why does that chair have wheels? That chair's got wheels on it. Why does it got wheels on it, Dad? Look at that. Why does it have wheels? I don't know. Maybe he got wheeled around in that chair or something. Didn't even know somehow they had missed that in school or something, or no one had ever told them that. So I have a feeling that there's still a lot of people that come by and don't know why there are wheels on that chair. So that's why, I might add this, it's so important what the commission is doing in terms of educational materials that people get when they go to the monument, to be able to tell them why there are wheels on that chair.
Dr. Walner, do you want to add anything before I jump to my next question? Okay. Senator Harkin, the idea that father didn't know why President Roosevelt was in that wheelchair and what that means about education not being taught. It made me think about aspects of the FDR legacy that, given the tenor and tone of the conversation about education now, might not be taught at all because of certain laws against quote-unquote critical race theory, or another law in Florida, the so-called Woke Act in Florida, where, through very subjective rules, certain aspects of our history that need to be taught won't be taught because they make people uncomfortable. What do you make of that?
I guess I never thought of it in those terms, but I suppose that could be part of it. I think it's kind of the whole kind of history of disability rights and inclusion, disability rights movement. A lot of people without disabilities felt uncomfortable around people with disabilities, I guess there was a feeling that, well, that could happen to me, and I don't, a lot of people got nervous being around persons with disabilities, and so they wanted to exclude them, keep them out, put them in institutions, keep them out of society. So that was the whole problem. One of the big problems of the disability rights movement was breaking down those unfounded fears and preconceived ideas. So perhaps you may have touched on something I hadn't thought about, and that is maybe they're not teaching things like this in school because maybe it might make somebody uncomfortable. To me, it sounds ridiculous. But I mean,
You have it so. You're right, Senator Harkin. Dr. Woolner, the senator points to the fact that some people might be made uncomfortable by disability issues, but FDR has a significant racial legacy that could, I can't believe this is even possible, but might not be taught in schools precisely because it just touches on matters of race. Imagine if school kids won't be able to learn about the Tuskegee Airmen and the Red Tails simply because, well, you have to talk about segregation and why they were there in the first place.
No, it's a very critical issue. As an educator, of course, I'm really concerned about it. And we have to look honestly at the past, And part of what was so wonderful about the memorial is it provided this opportunity to reassess President Roosevelt's decision, which was a political decision to engage in what the author Hugh Gallagher famously wrote was a splendid deception. This idea that he had largely recovered from his disability. As many of Roosevelt's grandchildren will tell you, the American people knew that he had a disability, but they didn't realize the extent of it, and they didn't realize that he used a wheelchair. And it's a very interesting part of his life story, actually, because I've written about this. He started to use the wheelchair in public at the end of his life. In March of 1945, famously gave his Yalta address sitting down and apologized for the fact that he was sitting down because he said it's a lot easier for me to sit than to stand with 10 pounds of steel strapped around my legs after a 14,000-mile trip. And when he was looking forward to speaking before the United Nations, he told Henry Morgenthau, this is the night before he died, that he was going to address the gathering in San Francisco in his wheelchair. So it's a very important story. And again, if you look at the cartoons, and this is where it's so important about, And I'm not surprised about the family that didn't realize that, because of course, if you look at cartoons of Franklin Roosevelt, he's jumping over the Grand Canyon. He's racing trains. He's leading the country. He is a man of action, which he was. And that was the political necessity of the time, was that he had to project himself as a man of vigor and health, because as Senator Harkin said, people who are, and I'm using this term intentionally here, people who were crippled, people who are not comfortable with that idea. So when it comes to confronting the past, whether it be issues of race, we have to look at these issues honestly. We have to understand that Franklin Roosevelt was not perfect. He engaged in the internment of Japanese Americans during the Second World War, which was a grave error and a tremendous black mark against his name. We have to admit that openly and freely. One of the things that I'm very proud of is when I worked at the Roosevelt Library, they had an exhibition on Japanese internment. So these are the kinds of things that we need to do. We need to confront the past with honesty and recognize the failings of our leaders, but also those accomplishments. One thing that I would like to say, and I may be wrong about this, Mary, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems to me that George H.W. Bush, President Bush, when asked what was his most significant legacy, said the Americans with Disabilities Act. Is that true? The Americans with Disabilities Act. The ADA is his.
George H.W. Bush signed into law.
Yeah, signed into law. He was the most proud of that accomplishment.
I will add this as a Democrat. Last time we got the bill passed, well, one of the things, we had the president on our side. President Bush never wavered, never buckled, never got weak knees. He was always for getting the ADA through Congress. And I got a lot of stories about that, but you don't have the time.
And actually, honestly, we don't. So don't get fired up. In the time that we have left, because we actually have less than 7 minutes left, I would love for each of you just to get some final thoughts about FDR, the time that we're in, and the lessons that we could learn from that time for what we're dealing with right now. Anything that you want to share in the time that we have left, and I'll start with you, Mary.
Thank you. Students go to the FDR Memorial. They're brought through, and there are endless numbers of lesson plans and educational materials that you can get downloaded off of the website. And I'm all for folks learning about D-Day and Pearl Harbor and the Great Depression. That absolutely has to happen. But as someone who has spent a number of years also working in a classroom, we need more than that to engage the students today. And we need educational content that speaks to the student, that draws the direct connections. And it is there. It's just changing it up a little bit more. And it is going to those underrepresented narratives. Maybe they're not underrepresented to everybody, because certainly the Japanese American community, that's not an underrepresented narrative, but in other communities it is. But making more elements of the FDR and Eleanor legacy accessible to larger populations, and making it turnkey, so that when you go to the FDR Memorial, you can also start a conversation about the Holocaust and follow up with a visit to the Holocaust Museum, or vice versa. Or as I mentioned, Mary McLeod Bethune and the Black Cabinet, that absolutely should get married together. Visiting also the Japanese American Memorial to Patriotism after you've been at the FDR Memorial or vice versa. There are so many elements to the FDR Memorial that speak to today's generation, and it's us educators who need to infuse that and that new energy, and the educators need help. And I'd say that's one thing that we always need to keep in mind. Bricks and mortar can build these memorials, but when you get that busload of kids marching through the memorial, you gotta have some good stories to tell in order to keep them engaged. And so that's where we need to make sure that we are putting our focus on. And I'd finally say is I'm really proud of the work that we've been doing to make sure that the disability legacy of the FDR Memorial gets told. We're not done yet. We've got a lot more educational content left to get out there and other stories to tell. But if you check out our content on our website, you'll see that we've been trying to put out good content so that there could be those interesting stories for those students who walk through the memorial.
And I want to be mindful of time. We've got less than 4 minutes left, and I'm mindful of time because Valerie has to run to the airport to get back to Chicago, so I'm going to come to you last. Dr. Wolder, final thoughts.
All right, well, I would say two things. Speaking of Ukraine and the terrible struggle that's going on and this against democracy and autocracy, Roosevelt, in passing the Lend-Lease Act, going before Congress, asking for the appropriation, said that peace cannot be bought at the price of other people's freedom. I think is a very appropriate moment to think about. And then, concerning the pandemic and the statue and the wheelchair and these issues, Senator Harkin, he was at the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota, speaking about that institution, and he said, medicine concerns many things besides the healing of the sick. It has taught us how science may be made the servant of a richer, more complete common life. Even more importantly, perhaps, it has taught us lessons in the ethics of human relationships, a devotion to public good, unselfish service, never-ending consideration of human needs are in themselves conquering forces. I think that sort of wraps up your tenure in the Senate, by the way.
Senator Harkin, final thought.
Franklin Roosevelt, because of his disability and because he went to Warm Springs, it was the first time that he ever saw real poverty. And he came from a wealthy family, very privileged. He had a charmed kind of life, Assistant Secretary of the Navy, a state senator, vice presidential candidate. And at age 39, he gets polio. Think about that, age 39, right after he'd run for vice president, as a matter of fact. So he sees his world collapsing around him. He thinks he can beat it. He thinks he can beat polio. But he finds Warm Springs, Georgia, the healing waters, and he goes down there. He gets a little house, and he gets a car that he could drive with a handbrake and all that. And he starts going out in the countryside. He had a favorite place, I've been there, but he had a favorite place where you could overlook this one kind of a valley. And he could cut all the trees down. Firewood, things like that, he cut all the trees down. So he had some deep pockets, so he said we should plant some trees there. First bill that President Roosevelt got through Congress as president was the Civilian Conservation Corps to go out and plant millions of trees all over America. Secondly, there was a small public school in the countryside, just a couple of miles outside of Warm Springs. And he would stop there. And of course, school was all black children. And they had no electricity. But the schools in Warm Springs had electricity. It was like a mile or so. You can see it, it's still down there. He paid to have electric wires taken out to that school so the kids would have electricity. Lights. Again, one of the first bills he got through was what? Rural electrification program to get electricity to rural areas like where I live. So I'm just saying, I think because of his disability, he got sensitized to the plight of people that didn't have much, that had a bad break in life. And he was able to use that to move the whole country. So that's how I think of Roosevelt. His polio may have been, for him, a curse at one time, but I think in a way it was a blessing for all of us, because it gave him sort of the wherewithal, the courage, and the sensitivity to heal, as my father used to say, a crippled nation.
Valerie Jarrett, last word to you.
I think we as adults have a responsibility to educate our children accurately and fully and inclusively, and that not just some stories deserve to be told, but that all stories that make up our nation deserve to be told. And I think we should not underestimate our young people's ability to get comfortable feeling uncomfortable. And so for us to celebrate the incredible life and legacy of FDR and Eleanor Roosevelt completely, and not hide parts of him which actually turned out to be part of his magic superpower, I think is so important for all of our young people to learn. And so I want to thank you all for all the work that you've put into creating this incredible legacy, because we do stand on their shoulders. And hopefully, when all of our young people have a better appreciation for his life, and we can't take that for granted because they don't know as much as they should, and if it makes them squirm a little when they hear the full story, so be it. That's what will help them grow and have a better understanding of us all.
Valerie Jarrett, Dr. Woolman, Senator Harkin, Mary Dolan, thank you all very much for this beautiful conversation.